This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, I think we can start. So welcome everyone. So we resume our seminar series after the break, and it's great that Fiona can join us to talk about, I suppose this is part of the book, or yes?
Great, it is.
So looking at APRA in 1940s and 50s, I think the title is The Promise of APRA and Why It Failed. So, over to you, Fiona.
Thank you. Well, it's great to see so many people. I was not quite sure if APRA was going to be a bit too modern for some of the people whose interests, as I share, is in the 19th century. What I'm going to do is actually base myself on a chapter which is in this book, which I don't think many people will have read yet, but still to do some commentary on this. And just to place this, the book is a discussion of citizenship, and that's been a guiding thread through the different chapters, is really local ideas of citizenship. How did these evolve? How did they emerge? What changed? In a town, an Andean province. And particularly, what happened, what was the connection between how local citizenship was seen and the relationship with the state, because it wasn't always to do with citizenship, didn't necessarily have a direct relationship with the state. So that you get formal definitions of citizenship which tend to get fixated on elections and at the national level. I'm working within a local context, and my material are local documents. So that this is something that's trying to emerge from out of a discussion that's going on in part of the Andes, which I suspect is not peculiar to this place. My interest is not to do a monograph of just one place and say it's unique, not at all. I think it reveals certain social movements that I think were far more widespread, of which was leading up to APRA. So that the background, or the more conceptual background, has been recent discussions about inclusive citizenship and even insurgent citizenship, rather than this idea of electoral citizenship. Now, the book does start in the 1870s, because that was a time when in Peru the Partido Civil, Civilistas, formed by Manuel Pardo, was supportive of a more inclusive citizenship. This was sort of the last time this was happening, and of trying to expand the concept of citizenship to the working classes, particularly in Lima. Not a lot is written about this, although I'm sure people will tell me, but Paul Gutenberg does have some of this material about how important incipient movements amongst artisans, shopkeepers, traders, was in actually forming some of the ideas of civilismo, which it wasn't just an oligarchic project. And it meant that worker education was being put on the agenda, and some ideas about transforming organisations from the old corporatist ideas of guilds into something like mutual associations, mutual aid associations. Now, what one finds even from the 70s, this we're talking 1870s, before the war with Chile, is that some master craftsmen who were belonging to some of these coastal movements were actually coming almost as political agents to some parts of the Andes. Just as later one gets the messengers from the Andes coming down to Lima, one gets political actors going and moving about in some towns where there was a stronger artisan group and beginning to politicise. This becomes far more prominent in the 1890s, and much more then fueled by Manuel González Prada, the Partido Radical y Unión Nacional, which was a radical party that González Prada started. He then left it pretty quick and came to Europe, but there was again this intent to bring in, reach these working classes with a more socialist perspective. More master craftsmen come to Tarma, the town where I'm working. They're printers, they are carpenters, but the printers are the most important. And people, also some rather different professionals, including a very enlightened, gifted chemist, Adolf Wienerich, whose gravestone is on the cover of the book, and who had been a disciple of González Prada and who came back to the homeland of his mother in order to fight against the elite and the corrupt church. He comes back in 1892, and so throughout the 90s there is a very vibrant radical movement in Tarma which concentrates a lot on education. But education, he's a bit of a forerunner of Gramsci. His ideas, this has been of an education was not to pervade the state and indoctrinating education, but to liberate the minds of people to become citizens in their own right, who are independent and can form a movement. This movement in the beginning of the 20th century is heavily repressed. This was the opening in the 90s, and it gets heavily repressed in the beginning of the 20th century. And Wienerich, when the period of municipal autonomy dies, as it did, local elections are stopped, powers and attributes of local government are taken away by a centralising state, and Wienerich almost exemplifies the sort of the pain that was being felt. He commits suicide in 1908. But there's a legacy that goes on. This is the important point about that. That I've termed in the book of the first radical wave. And it's the idea of a working class, even in a relatively small Andean town. Second radical wave, a very different political constellation, but is fighting for indigenous rights. And this is the 1920s, a certain opening of Leguía during his 11-year rule. And particularly, there's a Comité Pro Derecho Indígena Tahuantinsuyo, which has has had a lot of exchange with the Socialist Party and with Mariátegui in particular. This is denounced in the mid-1920s as a communist plot. There is, both nationally and in Tarma, a virulent press against these Bolsheviks, these Reds, this communist plot, which is seen to be purveyed by indigenous rights organisations. And this, again, it leads to a collapse of the second radical wave in 1927. It's dissolved. Hanging over it, the idea that anything that is to do with indigenous rights must be socialist and must be communist and must be the antithesis of being a citizen, because these people were branded as traitors rather than as proto-citizens. That's the context when APRA starts off. And I think, looking at a local history, it's important to frame it in there has been these movements, already a consciousness about workers' rights, education, which there's an ongoing local political projects. So the fact that when APRA comes in, as it were, there's a negotiation going on. It's not just that APRA creates its affiliates and supporters. It is that APRA weaves itself into political projects that are already underway. And as one can immediately say, there's bound to be collisions of interest. It almost cannot help this. And I think the playing out of what I was calling the promise of this third radical wave is really to do with a local political project which is coming into, has aspirations, has hopes that a national Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana will actually do something more in their interests. And this is what is being let down. APRA, as some people know, Peru, was a mass opposition party that was founded by Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre while he was in exile as a Pan-American movement in 1924. And it gets transformed into a national political party in Peru in 1930. But I'm going to try and steer away from the national view, what it purported to be nationally. We have people who know a lot more about that, well, Paolo. Here, I'm trying to, as I say, keep within how was it being presented and how did apristas present themselves within this province or the town of Tarma. So this was, I'm going to do it in two parts. One, what kind of constituency did APRA have in the town, and what's the kind of periods we're talking about here. And then the second part looked particularly at the Bustamante government, 1945 to 48, when this was a leftist-leaning coalition in which APRA was in government along with a collection of other parties, again leftist-leaning, but at the short period, 45 to 48, APRA did dominate some pretty important ministries, which I'm going to be talking about, Ministry of Education and Ministry of Agriculture. And looking at what this collision meant in that tragic period of Bustamante, really, why APRA failed to deliver at that period. Okay. A photograph survives, given to me by a good friend, and we know it must have been taken in 1931. You see a fairly chubby man with a bow tie, who I think is Victor Raúl Aya de la Torre. And it's taken in the Hotel Bolivar in Tarma. And it is the foundation meeting of the Provincial Council of APRA in 1931. And it gives a pretty clear visual impression of who did APRA start off with in the town. They're fairly well dressed, they get their hats, they're mostly, you'd say, white mestizo. Quite a lot of Italian immigrants are there. The family who gave me this photograph know that there are several family members of Italian extraction. The man sitting next to Victor Raúl is Pedro Macassi, who became the first Secretary General, a lawyer. And he was still alive when I was there in the 1970s. The man with gig lamp spectacles is Francisco Palomino. He was also still alive when I was there in the 70s. And so Roberto Garcia is also in the group. I'm not quite sure, but he was there. Now, these three men I was able to talk to when I first did fieldwork in Tarma in the mid-1970s. Unfortunately, I didn't always think of asking the right questions, and that's what happens. But I got a flavour of what these pioneering local apristas, who they were. So just to sort of fill in a bit, Macassi came from a family who had been very active in the first radical wave. They were friends of Wienerich. Many of them had become school teachers. He chose to be a lawyer because that was where a profession that would give him a possibility of acting politically. He went to Lima, he studied in San Marcos, he came back, and all his clients were from the comunidades. They'd come with land titles, and he was somebody who tried to work always with the comunidades. Palomino was the son of an artisan, a sastre, a tailor, who was allowed not to follow his father into the same trade. He had a secondary education, was allowed to go to Lima, where he studied to be a chemist, pharmaceutical, consciously following the tradition of Wienerich. I mean, he says this. He became politicized in the 20s in Lima, comes back to Tarma, engages very much in some of the confrontations going on in the mining zone. Tarma, I should say, because there's a crappy map which I'm not showing you, lies between the mining zones of Cerro de Pasco, Leroli, and Morococha on the western margins in the highlands, and then downhill is the Chanchamayo lowlands that were being recolonised in this period and attracting many settlers, Chinese to begin with, Italian, German, Brits who then inherited or got hold of the Pyrenees colony. So that this Tarma at 3,000 metres is a relatively productive, rich farming region in the highlands that became prosperous across the board because of supplying labour, but mostly resources and pack animals to the commodity production going on both sides of the province. So the third man, Garcia, he became head of the truck drivers union, another very important profession at that period. There wasn't a link, there wasn't a road to Lima at the time. Trucks were coming up by the Central Railway, and then there was quite a bit of, quite an explosion of truck transport during the 30s, but mostly to the railhead, up and down from the Chanchamayo, Aguardiente, the coffee, and to the roadhead. Now, the interesting thing about these three men, that none of them come from the elite. All of them were able to get an education, a higher education, and enter skilled occupation or professions. So they kind of typify new actors with new kinds of brokerage between town and country. Palomino, for example, as a chemist, was providing consultations to people coming to the Sunday market. As I said, Macassi was dealing really only with community land problems. The truck driver was in a very ambiguous position as a truck driver, as a petty capitalist, obviously sometimes buying cheap and selling beer. Each of them was having a rather different relationship, but trying to broker relations between town and countryside. And I think it was interesting that they, in particular, see APRA as a set of aspirations for what they wanted. On proclaiming itself a national party, there was just a few years, so this was from 1930 to 33, there was some material in the local press. Tarma did have a succession of interesting newspapers, and a flourish. I mean, each kind of political movement was then expressed in newspapers that took one side or the other. And local press was then reinterpreting in the early 30s what APRA stood for. And so it was partly quoting Aida Lattori about the restrictions on foreign capital, on the worry about or seeing sort of APRA's historical mission to be a creation of a nation based on an integrated economy and authentically representative state. They would come there, but they also added certain political messages which not necessarily were being articulated by APRA Centre, and that was about democratization and decentralization. So that this was pinning this feeling, this need to express citizenship on the part of growing middle classes, professional classes, men like who are sitting there, who wanted a return of municipal autonomy and greater decision-making of local government. There had been local elections that in Tarma functioned up to really about 1910. I think formally, legally, local elections are only totally abolished in 1919 when the Legia comes in, but it had been totally restricted. But in the early 20th century, local elections worked, and the largest group of literate men who had the franchise were the artisans. So the artisans could combine with comerciantes and others to actually elect non-elite provincial councils, and they did. This had fallen away, but this legacy continued of wanting to bring back local elections and to have resources in which to govern themselves. And this was being pinned on to APRA that was much, much more ambiguous about all this, because the whole philosophy, as I point out, is being much more of a strong state that APRA was trying to promote, to say only with a strong state, which APRA would provide, can workers' rights be secured. So there was this dilemma, getting affiliates, times like Tarma, but at the same time, so agreeing to some amount of this wish for decentralisation, but at the same time having a project that had was far more centralist, or it became far more centralist. So, at the very start, 250 men signed up to APRA, this was 1931. Immediately there were aprista unions formed, school teachers and truck drivers. The provincial committee, of which this was a group, put forward a highly developmentalist set of public services that we wanted. It's astonishingly sort of modern format to read. It was pipe water, it was sewage disposal, it was a hospital. I mean, there was a set of quite modern, the modernity was expressed in certain kinds of infrastructure. And so all this was kind of articulated and wished for. The apristas tried very hard to separate themselves from the communists. Communist Socialist Party, who were actively organising the mines, but partly I think because of the experience of the 1920s, when this whole communist conspiracy had really put paid to an indigenous rights organisations. It wasn't just an ideological, and I know Anna's got a great piece on more of the ideological. Here it was partly locally, this was strategy. You did not want to be labelled communist, because that, back in the mid-20s, and that wasn't far in the past, had such very devastating results as to the legitimacy. So this was partly why locally there was a great attempt to say, and it wasn't terribly ideologically well-founded, but we are different, and we're going to create this wonderful new bonding between manual and work, manual labour and intellectual labour, create frentes únicos, create cooperatives. There was this whole sort of populist way of saying we're not interclass antagonism, that was in the past, we've had that, we're going to create this frente único. And that again fed into the APRA ideas. The political opening in the 30s quickly closed. By 1933 there was a kind of shilly-shallying between Arias and Benavides, and in the end APRA was declared illegal and suffered a decade of political persecution, recalled by the faithful as the catacumbas. This, I think, was a very damaging series of what then happened with APRA, because the whole idea of the clandestinity being put outside the law in a society that's highly legalistic, this meant that certain forms of party politics, of the ways of doing politics, become sort of does not have a great deal to do with citizenship or participatory citizenship or open deliberation. It becomes of acts of survival. APRA goes underground in Tarma, but it explodes into the public arena in 1938. That is hailed as the significant date celebrating 400 years since the Spanish foundation, although there's very little historical evidence that it was a Spanish foundation. It was, according to Carmen Arellano, it was a reducción in the period of Toledo, but anyway, they celebrated. This brought this group of people who's probably largely apristas, but hidden, onto the street in a public protest to complain against the completely useless provincial council and a corrupt mayor, who had all been put in place, of course, by officially by the president, but on the recommendation of the biggest taxpayers in the province, would make recommendations, the president would agree. And so Mayor de Marini called out the National Guard to disperse this riot, and wrote to Benavides saying, a certain political party working in the shadows is intensifying its separatist campaign, trying in different ways to discredit our public institutions and bring our noble functionaries and men devoted to government and the rule of law into disrepute. They stubbornly persist in inciting public opinion, making scandalous allegations against us, men of government, and they hold out marvellous dreams that are totally unrealisable about the coming age of social justice. Now that's the kind of key. Again, the APRA was trying to promote itself on the social justice. De Marini's response, heavy-handed response of calling out the Guardia Civil and trying to get rid of the riot, brought many more people into APRA, including renegade sons of the property owners. And so, I mean, it was becoming a sort of mass movement because of this heavy-handed way of trying to control it. It also, during the next government comes into power and unfortunately puts back the discredited council until 600 people signed a petition to the new president saying, we don't want this hand-picked De Marini anymore. We want a more representative provincial council. And at the same time, the local press, just in this beginning of the 40s, is going back to talk about Weenrich. Weenrich is now being promoted as a hero, as a saviour, as a model, particularly in Tarma, but also in some of the national press. He'd been forgotten. He was just being labelled as Peru's first folklorista. He gets remembered as a political figure at times when there is some kind of political rupture. This is a kind of very unstable identity that is given to Tarma's sort of leading radical. He can be safely put aside as being just into folklore, and then he gets wheeled out to say, look, Tarmanians, if you want change, you've got to be political. And that was happening in the early 40s. Okay.
What's the name of the folklorist?
Adolfo Weenrich. Weenrich. This hopefully will re-establish Adolfo Weenrich into the historiography of Peru. Please note, because he's been... No, there are a few things. Paolo at one early stage suggested that the whole book would centre around him, and in a way it does. But because he's one of these examples of a local political figure from the 1890s, whose reputation then becomes, is remembered locally, and when it's safe to talk about him as a political figure, it happens. But he's kept alive when it's safer to talk about popular culture. And I find this transition between an open political figure and a covert folklorist is a very interesting way, but it doesn't grab the headlines. And I think some of his group of youngsters then are quite a lot with Mariátegui, and I think there is a transfer of some of Weenrich's ideas that go into Mariátegui, unacknowledged, but there is some sort of feeding in, and I think this again, he's not unique. This is something that happens to local provincial figures in this whole way in which Peru is made provincial, or the province is made provincial during state formation. This happens to local leaders who then become provincialized in terms of what actually is done. So looking at sort of local sources, one then picks up, what there is a families remember. There's a sort of sometimes unexpressed, even in the 1990s, people will still dispute that he didn't commit suicide, he was murdered by the prefect. I mean, there's a whole sort of local narratives. I'm going to go on to the second part, which is that 40s were then this kind of period of again sort of politicisation going on. And so this was all leading up to the fact that in 1945, through an election, that José Luis Bustamante, lawyer from Arequipa, stands for election and gets elected from with this coalition, including APRA. He had visited Tarma just before the election, and 25 days before the national election, the outlawed parties become legal once more and emerge out of clandestinity. And so APRA rebrands itself as Partido del Pueblo and organises meetings, as does the Partido Vanguardia Socialista, also opening offices in Tarma. So these are branch offices. All parties have branch offices, and they've done so since the 1890s. Okay, so expectations ran very high. Here was a change going to happen. There was a lot of backing. This was the party of progress, and there was a belief that the next radical way would give greater political rights. It was the APRA stood for both modernity but also the belief that economic improvement would lead to political rights. At the same time, as we see, there's a more diverse urban society coming into being, a lot more public servant kind of jobs being created in the provinces, but still having to fight against this heavy hand of the repressive oligarchy with this military guy, Demerini, who was still able to put things down by force. Right, Bustamante gets elected. Expectations ran high that political institutions and practices would be transformed rapidly. An attempt was made. The provincial council changed its name. It was now called a Junta Municipal Transitoria, with the direct idea that the junta, what was being named from Lima as the office bearers of local government, it was going to be a transition phase of the junta. It was preparing the way for a new kind of legislation, which would mean that a rather different municipal body would be put in place. They were staffed in Tarma, they were staffed entirely both at provincial and district level by apristas. So this was hand-plucked people, and they wrote very sort of affectionately to each other. You can see this in the municipal archive, and they signed themselves apristamenti stuyo. I mean, there was like this kind of way of saying we're going to get the enemy now. We're now in power. They met immediately a lot of disdainful commentary from the elite, who paints them as being not culto, and they were the wrong social class that had come into power. Now, reflecting this, one of my main sources has been the municipal archive of letters written by the mayors and actas of the provincial council. This was a very rich municipal archive up to 1910, 1908, 1910. There's almost nothing in it during the 10s and the 20s and 30s. With this new government and with the juntas municipales transitorias, the archive suddenly flourishes again. Suddenly, lots of documentation, lots of things are kept. And so this kind of relationship between the documents you keep and the power you think you have. You're not just relaying to Lima. There's a belief that you're actually going to be doing something in local government. So that's where some of this now it picks up again, and I can trace what was happening. Already, though, from 45, there is this problem of the centralism versus this aspiration for greater local governing power. And the way round this was seen to be a huge miasma, a maze of fuzzy words that apristas start using, in which democracy, all sorts of nice sounding words become a sort of a haze, which partly almost obscures these quite different sort of political projects that are going on. And it's really, when the apristas lived in clandestinity, then all these kind of real politic issues weren't coming to the fore, but they come to the fore, of course, in 45, when there is the party is in power. New development plans are made. Makassi becomes deputy mayor, and he's the one who travels. And so he goes down constantly with projects and proposals to Lima. He's the one who goes to all the big meetings in Lima. And he's the one who's the channel for the connection, for what the province wants, compared to what was there before. The first area that becomes highly contentious is there was in 1946 an Asamblea Nacional Aprista Municipal, which officials from Aprista municipios invited to Lima to debate a future decentralization strategy. I've seen nothing about this, and I'm looking at Pablo because he will tell me. I've seen it reported. The law was passed in 1946, and Carlos Contreras talks about that. But I found in a district municipal archive the recommendations that were first made on which the law was based. Now, the recommendations, one can say, were quite regressive. What was recommended was that you were to go back to a dual administrative structure, whereby, like in the early 19th century, towns would be allowed to vote into office their mayors. They'd have right to collect taxes and right to make investments in social services, and women now would be given, literate women would be given the right to vote. But outside the towns, and as they said, to take account of the different aptitudes and capacities for modern local government in the country's interior, indigenous communities were completely non-recognised. Their form of government was completely non-recognised, and the idea was to put them back under the prefect, who would protect and administer the indigenous areas. So no longer would it be the department, province and district, it would be urban citizens and rural subjects. Which, this is what Mariapti always said would happen, that the Campasanas would never be able to bear a kind of more progressive set of exchanges. But anyway, this was the proposal. But it did mean that there was a lot of buy-in, because there was a local in the towns would be re-established, and there was a whole language of citizenship. The official communique that came from this meeting was: the democratic function of the pueblos will be manifested in the government elected by its citizens to regulate and order urban life. In this way, municipal government will become a genuine expression of citizenship. The law was passed, it was never implemented, and that was one nail in APRA's coffin, you could say, that there was all this from Tarma and other towns, a great feeling that this should happen. Part of the recommendation, though, was that once the reform was made law, municipal authorities were promised support and guidance from a Central de Asuntos Municipales set up inside the APRA party. Also, a bureau set up also inside the APRA party would be making connections between the municipios and even international governments. Now, this is beginning, the party, APRA, is in power, but it is following a party project and trying to take make the mystique of the party, but not the mystique of the state. Why, if this is a decentralization law, would the Central de Asuntos Municipales be inside a party and not the state? And when seeing this, I think throughout this period, that it's like the party is part of government, but it is doing party political stuff and is not a respecter of not trying to build up a meta-authority of a state which goes above party interests. And I hadn't quite realised that. I mean, this is until kind of, thinking it through again, that was what was happening. The second area second sort of nail in the coffin for APRA was this attempt to create a new civil society. This was again this Frente Único, co-operativism, making a kind of new solidarity again in the town. This was completely fractured because of economic chaos. And again, there's not much written about this, but clearly it depended which region we were talking about, but the Central Andes at this period was finally being linked by a motor road to Lima. This opened up the possibilities of truck transport to compete with the Central Railway, and it was much less easy to control truck transport than to control the railway. Part of the economic policy of particularly the apristas was a form of Keynesianism which actually put up salaries to public employees. Put up salaries of school teachers, the police, the army. This then created a massive demand. There was also the APRA promise to make life cheaper in the coastal cities, or in the cities. And this put immense pressure on the food markets. Even in the end of 1945, an estimate from the Ministry of Agriculture was that the black market for foodstuffs was higher than the official market. Because price intervention, price controls were being applied, but everything was so competitive. Tarma, now linked to the capital, could only watch trucks taking foodstuffs away from the province, and the province was used to cheap food. It was losing out because stuff was all going down to Lima, from Chanchamayo, from the property owners formed a cartel so that they would take their goods away anyway because they had to bring down the APRA local government or bring down APRA. So there was an economic chaos. The local press is full of this desperate situation of having to queue for food. The Junta Municipal had to install food rationing, a ticket system. Every family was only allowed to exchange tickets in official distribution points and buy to buy official prices. This caused again an enormous discrediting. The Junta Transitoria sent its one truck around villages to try and buy up food to supply the town. But there was already this huge fear about this mounting costs of living because everything was being sold in the black market and you couldn't keep official prices. And there begins to be this beginning to say, we need a strong man to protect us. That European, almost in parallel in Europe, this economic insecurity, the household, cooperatives couldn't cope. Things broke down, that you got cooperatives formed just of particular occupations. There was nothing solidaric about this. It was going into trying to protect your access. APRA members got privilege because they could buy easy and non-apristas. And that again was something that in a very short time was damaging. The final area was APRA again using party and rather than seeing itself as part of the state in terms of policy towards education. Much more funding was put into education. I mean, it was almost a model in the mid-40s. Indigenistas, Alguedas become part of Ministry of Education. They have very enlightened ideas, in a sense, compared to previously, about what rural education should be like. But APRA is in charge of the Ministry of Education. And APRA plays other games about trying to control all the unions, teachers' unions, not allow other parties in. And there's an outcry, again from the local press, about how you had to be nominated a teacher, you had to belong to the APRA party. Normalistas who were wanted by particular communities found themselves without a job because they were being displaced by APRA. This created, again, the anti-APRA press made tremendous deal out of this, saying this is overriding all what we want in the province, which is to have more control of our own life. Meanwhile, the teaching as a profession, and Carlos Contreras has a nice quote on this, for the 40s, was that Peru's traditional society of señores and peasants was now shaken by the presence, timid at first, but massive from the 1940s, of an army of teachers who, for the first time in Peru's history, totaled more than the armed forces. Teachers, a lot of teachers were apristas. I mean, again, this was part of that kind of social group who had become apristas in the early days and making tyranny. Hurry on now. Right. So there was all these kind of issues to do with economic situation, corporatism that was collapsing, loss of this dream of municipal autonomy, and a politicization of the education system that was greater than before. What the men I talked to in the 1970s, and I was fortunately in an area that I did write down a lot of notes, was how in this period, by the late 40s, that the true apristas felt they had to break away from the official party. So you get, and this is again, these were old men looking back 40 years, but still, this was when breakaway groups came about. They still called themselves apristas, but you get what had been a party which had been so much clandestine, spawning small extremist clandestine groups. They organised through the schools, they organised through workers' education, and you've got a system of breakaway aprista teachers being in charge of politicising cells, clandestine, in the districts. And you're getting a model that we know later, of course, is directly relates to Mauro Sendero was organising. It's the same kind of model that goes back to the 40s, of being able to sort of get information, to proselytise at the local level through the schools. I think, just to sum up from that it was three conclusions. APRA had lost the opportunity to become, let's say, a creator of a greater state. I mean, it had lost an opportunity to put in reform, which had been possible and had been announced, but failed to do so. And there was a yawning gap between party discourse and the actual skills which were brought to bear in governing an extremely difficult situation. I mean, it's not to say that they were very unlucky, if you like, at that period when a left-wing government came to power. And the cooperatives were completely unable to construct a kind of front to defend people's interests. So there was a huge loss of credibility. But also, one sees again that the kind of party discipline that had kept a clandestine party alive during the Cumbas was not able to then be an enlightened governing party. I mean, there's something that just does not. This is not the way in which governance can become a more effective if there is a background of working in the shadows, of being labelled outside the law, that it has really, and I think throughout, and why I'm stressing this is that I think that APRA did have a chance of doing something better, and the fact that it failed spawned a lot of much more extremist movements, of which an end product was Sendero. I mean, I see this as a galvanizing, the 40s was a galvanizing time in which there was a trajectory that then comes afterwards. And APRA had forfeited its radicalism. I mean, it might have begun as a radical movement, but once it got in power, it was established. What the dissidents hated, and this came through from my talks with some of the old men, they got dictates from APRA Central as to who they should elect as diplomat. And they said, no way, we're not having a centralist party tell us who we're going to elect. That pushed a lot of people into breakaway groups. Tragically, all this came to an end through the military coup in 1948, that happened to be done by Tarma Odria, who had been part of that government and who launched took power as the Restoration Movement, and immediately APRA's outlawed, leading apristas are put into jail, including Macassi and quite a lot of the Tarmeños, and the Tarmeños rush off to say, look, you're a fellow Tarmeño, please, put before him all the demands that they felt had not been satisfied by APRA. Now, Odria, of course, had very good fortune to come at a propitious economic time. Not only did the Korean War boost Peru's exports and further away from the Second World War, but this was the beginning of the Cold War, when Odria declared his strong support for the US and entered into very lucrative alliances. According to Peter Klein, military aid rose from about $100,000 in 1952 to $9.1 million in 1956. Massive military aid coming in. And with that, Odria creates a highly restrictive and surveillance state. This is where internal security comes very heavily. But he is the caudillo who gives the order, and he has a form of popularity. So there's something about that promise of APRA which I wanted to really sort of bring out. But the way that the way this played out was something that did lead to political violence as being put on the agenda. And I'm not sketching out these links too closely, but that's why I think that sort of follows in the course of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Time for questions, comments? Yeah, Chris?
May I play the devil's advocate, or two devil's advocates? In one sense, I come away thinking that all you're seeing with aprismo is an alternative form of clientelism. Once it's in power, an alternative form of clientelism, giving out its teaching jobs to its mates, its sons probably, perhaps its daughters, handing out its public sector contracts probably to similar people, engineers who've been trained in the expanding universities of the interwar period and so on. Probably giving out scholarships to the sons of apristas. And should one be surprised by this, or were the socialists and communists right all along that this was not a viable project? And then, on the other hand, the modernity of aprismo. Is it in broader Latin American terms, so impressive? You see trade union leaders in Chile in the 1920s advocating in the mining sector the appointment of public sector doctors. You see it at the same time amongst the Colombian banana workers. It's not only amongst miners. You see it amongst oil workers in Mexico, Venezuela. The theme of a cheap water, of a clean water supply, well, that's around across the continent in the 1920s. And I dare say that one international player might sweat the ruts about quite persuasively on Peru. The Rockefeller Foundation had a part which can be easily exaggerated, and was probably exaggerated by its own doctors, in fomenting with its allies amongst Peruvians an awareness of the importance of such things as a clean water supply, tackling such diseases as diarrhea and so on and so forth. And so I just wonder whether, on the one hand, socialists and communists get things right, and on the other hand, perhaps the conservatives were right. The resources weren't there for the APRISTA project. If one thinks back to the writings of Bill Albert on the First World War, the whole the literature surrounding the war, the World Depression, and the scramble over limited resources during the Depression, and the scramble over what is a slow, very punctuated, uneven recovery, uneven by region, by sector, and so on. So I'm puzzled as to why really one is surprised that the APRISTA project, attractive and alluring as it was, ultimately proved sadly limited in practice. I mean, the very secondary question, aviation, you mentioned roads. I know Colombia, I don't know Peru. Aviation plays a very important part in the Andes, in the Colombian Andes in the 30s and 40s. And for one thing, it enables national newspapers to reach provincial destinations. All but 2 provincial capitals on the day of publication. It enables people like the mayor you're speaking about to travel about. Regional figures to get to the capital city with relatively considerable ease compared to the previous period. And it means that government can get information about insurgency or the possibility of insurgency very much more rapidly than previously, though the telegraph has helped. And mail, of course, which I'm referring implicitly, was also being carried around by air. Now, I wonder if aviation is playing a part in the Peruvian picture and years you're talking about.
Not here. There's no airports. Well, until a bit later.
Steep.
No, to go back to the other, yes, it's not. I wasn't trying to kind of underline the surprise of these demands. My main interest is looking at what was happening between, in terms of political motivations, the way that politics was working at a local level, and what was then coming into being very contradictory in terms of the large party, as a way of trying to suggest that these radical waves throughout the 20th century were all being deemed illegal at some point. They're being put outside the law. They were becoming clandestine. What does this do to the way that political change is envisaged? Because I suppose my main concern has been to take a starting point to say, we know the recent history from the 1960s onwards of saying armed violence is a way in which we change society. And I'm trying to spool back into saying, what was the popular basis for this kind of approach, which gets to an extreme point with the Shining Path? And there's something that's going on in the 40s, which I think is a kind of pivotal. There were many difficulties of that period when APRA was in power. They probably didn't have a chance, but nevertheless, I mean, there was something that was going on then that I think sort of almost shifted a trajectory as to what was seen as what political strategies were then put on the table.
There was another, not really a question, but there was another guerrilla in the early 60s, which
Yes.
is a fraction of APRA.
Exactly.
What was it? The leader was here last year. What was the name?
Bejar.
That's right.
No, I mean that was a time. That's quoted as being. That's when the 60s. I mean, it was a Forquismo. It was after the Cuban Revolution. It was saying, well, let's make our Sierra Madre here in the Peruvian upper jungle. Didn't get much support, but again, sort of left-wing intellectuals carried on saying armed struggle is it. But I'd say that went further back, you see. I mean, my argument would be no. These breakaway apristas, amongst whom sitting there, they were sort of in this idea of a much more, they never said, well, using violence, but there was a much more extremist view as to how to organise to get political change, in which political violence would be contemplated. And that goes back to the 40s. And then it gets totally suppressed under Adria, yes, but it carries on.
I have a long comment and a couple of questions. I wanted to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, which touches me on a very personal level. My family comes from Huancayo, very close to Tarma, and very similar stories. My grandmother was born in 1895, and nearly every political story that she ever told me is reflected in your presentation. Yes. Her father, my great-grandfather, was a prefecto for a while in Huancavelica, but also he was part of the municipal government in Huancayo. There's a family history that once he organized some elections, and of course they went voting, and then the party the election had been fixed for had won. And then the guy who was the loser of the election came to see my great-grandfather to say, it's impossible that I didn't get a single vote, because I voted for myself. So, they weren't really reading these things with much finesse. But that's one of the stories that I find very interesting, which kind of shows some of the themes that you were mentioning here. But another story, she got married in 1914 to my grandfather, who came from Huancavelica, and he was from a Gamonal family. And his brother was a Gamonal. My grandfather was a lawyer instead. He trained in Lima and graduated in 1904. But his brother became an aprista. And my grandmother always used to say to him that it was impossible to be a Gamonal and an aprista. But apparently not. He was very happily both. But my grandfather was a lawyer and a teacher, and he was the head of Colegio Santa Isabel in Huancayo, where my father was born in 1934. And I had never really understood why he left the profession, but he had to leave teaching. And of course, it now occurs to me that he wasn't an aprista, he never was. My grandmother hated the apristas with all the wrath that could be envisioned. And she especially remembered the food rationing.
Right!
You remind us, because I remember in the 1980s when Ellen Garcia was elected in 85, she was incensed by the idea that anybody could vote for the apristas, saying that they could, that the first thing that would happen was that there would not be enough food. And sure enough, in the 1980s with Ellen Garcia, there wasn't enough food, and we were all queuing for provision. So my grandmother was by then quite elderly, but she still lived on her own, and she told anybody who would care to listen how this had always been a very bad idea, because the apristas couldn't be trusted. But what I wanted to ask you after kind of this very long prologue is why we have so little knowledge, A, of the APRA during these years, outside of the, the big fundadores, Victor Raúl pretty much is the only one who's ever had a book written on him. I think there's some things that are coming out now more recently. But A, that, and B, why don't we know more about this type of thing? And what do we, all that we ignore about the provinces? I mean, I know these things because of my family, but it's not very common, I think, that we actually have a historiographical take on that. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
No, I share your bemusement. I mean, I don't understand why there is so little, and I can also feel in myself that I was rather reluctant to take on board this period and APRA. I've never talked about APRA before in my life. This is I can branch into new things. No, because there is something that I find deeply problematic. Not that I'm Peruvian or have a aprista family, but it's still something that and that of course that also sparks one's interest. What is it that creates, even before one starts as a kind of hopefully a dispassionate and researcher, what creates this feeling that I've got to get over some kind of hurdle? But I suspect it's partly what you say, that so many families, particularly whose parentage comes from provinces, it's quite a family business to actually get into what was going on, because these fights were bloody. I mean, I think the tone in local newspapers, whether it was about of the pro and anti-apristas, it's a terrible discourse that is being promoted of mudslinging and hurtful. And a lot of the illusions you can no longer get because it's written, you don't know who the people were, but you can just get a feeling that this is so politicized. And I don't understand that. I don't understand that, and I don't understand, the other thing I don't understand is, again, this almost, why did a party put itself above what, if you like, given an outsider, why couldn't they be trying to create a stronger state, or a state that did more? Why did it have to be captured by parties? And I've kind of never seen that really before, as to being something fairly common, and a lot of talk about, a lot of hype about the state, and this and that, and patriotism, and armies, and yet there's sort of no shame in trying to sort of make the party the state. And that again is something that I think is well, I have a certain repugnance to. But I mean, I do hope that many more, because again, I think it becomes more interesting when you take a provincial view and you don't have to wade through all these layers of discourse. And one has Paolo, who tells us a lot more about why the communists and APRA were, how they sort of positioned themselves in a certain very critical period. So there is certain things coming out of APRA, but not enough. I don't know.
You had a question, but if I could just say something about this.
Go ahead, yeah.
I mean, I think if I could kind of contribute to this question about why there isn't more on APRA, I mean, I think it has a lot to do with the politics of Peruvian academia, which, APRA, for some reason, it had its original intellectuals, the generation of people Raúl with, Heisen and Sewan, and these, but then it didn't reproduce a second or a third generation of intellectuals. It had very mediocre people, frankly. And then people writing the history of the left tended to be anti-apristas because they were communists or of the new left, and so had no interest in writing about APRA. So the absence of writings on APRA is simply that there was no one to write it. The apristas could not write their own history. and the left were writing histories that minimised the role of APRA, both at the national level and at the local level. And then the other point, which I think is very important, why did aprismo always seek to bring power into the party instead of creating a state? I think this has to do with their experience of the 30s, when essentially they were denied power. Well, at least that's how they understood it. So when they come into power in 1945, I think from the very start they thought that they wouldn't be able to keep it for very long. So what power was available, they sought to concentrate within the party, not to strengthen the state. But I think that's something that this is just my impression. I think that's something that needs to be studied in great detail. I had a question, I suppose, about, or perhaps more a comment about, I think what you're saying and what David Nugent has said about Chachapoyas, and I suppose Lewis about Cajamarca, and Jamie Haleman about Ayacucho, points to, I think, a really interesting development of, in the sense that, APRA was the only sort of national popular party in Peru, but in some ways its local branches were not quite APRA. I mean, they grew locally, they responded to local issues, and their relation with the national party was never simple, and very often it was quite conflicted. So in some ways, I think, in writing the history of APRA, that dissenters APRA, we end up with not a history of a party, but a history of an archipelago of political movements. And maybe this explains a little bit of the history of APRA, that it was conflicted because the local units, party discipline could not be imposed in the way that you would expect a normal party to do it. And I don't know whether this is particularly Peruvian or why it came about, and we could discuss that. But it seems to me that from what literature has started to emerge in the last 10 or 15 years or a little bit more, that's the picture that's starting to emerge. I think that's quite interesting.
Definitely, and I think that's partly why my introduction of the earlier radical waves. It's got to be framed in that local history to understand why these guys were drawing as much on the 1890s, 1900s as their own, and creating their own hero in Wienerich, who gets resurrected. And then Hellman in Ayacucho is very much linking with the Tawantinsuyu. I mean, APRA was building on the Tawantinsuyu experience. I don't think that was quite as strong in Tarma. But these are political projects that can talk to each other, and hence I think this very hazy kind of ideology that gets produced, because somehow or other everybody can sort of somehow pitch in, everybody can be social justice, democracy, but if you can't get into a more analytical language, because then it all falls apart. I think that's right. But I'd still say, and again, my perhaps ignorance of detailed history, other Latin American countries, Peru, perhaps more than anywhere else, had a situation where presidents made opposition illegal. These were presidential decrees. What do you think?
Oh no, the opposition comes from within the ruling party, so this can't be possible in Argentina.
Right, so it's
no
not
opposition. I don't think there is anything.
There's something.
These are change of regimes that ban parties.
There were periods when
They banned the party, right?
they banned them from standing for elections.
Yeah, but they make them illegal.
There's something about
yeah, well,
So
they
it's the
ban
same,
them.
yeah.
But
ban
these are
illegal.
illegal.
There's the
Musically good,
concept.
not before.
Yeah, but But in Peru as well.
Really well.
In Peru as well, the ones that banned the parties are
Yeah.
mostly surplus.
Alejandro has
Just
one
to
question.
get out of this question, I don't have an answer. I will subcontract with another question. I know nothing of Argentina, as you've seen, and Peru as well. But echoing what Paulo said, and following your presentation, it seemed to me a not very unusual story for the development of the social movements, political movements in Latin America. As for the way this provincial local interest or agency is incorporated or co-opted into a broader scheme. And you started introducing these fellows as championing for a variety of things, but you didn't name representation. You didn't use the word representation, but I think that there's a drive to a claim for a form of representation that has not been considered. Now, when they evolved and when they become part of the APRA and so on, that demands or claims for representations, they got lost, or they are negotiated, or somehow they are transacted. So I'd like to know more how this happens. And something that probably may explain why we know little of the APRA or Peronism or whatever. Who are the contenders? Who are the people against this, apart from, Natalia and Magna? Because there seems to be cleavages that are very much at the family level. So who is standing against these guys?
Representation, let's go back to that. You see, this again,
May I? And it's a tricky question because representation is usually assumed under this analytical analysis you were mentioning before. And I think that one of the reasons why we don't understand this is because we have wrong concepts to understand representation.
I think I've sidelined this about trying to pose this in terms of ideas and concepts of citizenship. That's why I've sort of framed it in citizenship. That's why the book's called Citizenship as well. Because it changes form and it changes what are the ruling ideas in it. But there's something about a non-elite that wants inclusion. And that the form and the language in which that takes place changes. There can be citizenship rights. I quoted a bit from the recommendation for decentralization, which was to exercise citizenship rights. But it can also come into something like social justice, which is still a very, very powerful concept, which is slightly different from citizenship rights. Citizenship rights can be tainted, it can be put on, can be associated with a communist plot, as it was in the 20s, if we're saying that. So rather than the radical waves I'm trying to pick out does have something to do about extending to include other social groups within a political project. So it's not necessarily representation, but that's why I'm looking at inclusion and exclusion rather than...
It would be the form of representation, right?
Yes.
What we see at the end of the day, that this state is not autonomous. That's how it becomes like the party. So the demand for representation is to be included.
Yes. But very much, I mean, what was interesting about the 45, 46 discussions was that this was going back to elections held in the provinces for provincial councils, which was incredibly important in the late 19th century. This was a pride. Yes, there was abuses, but in Tarma, on 2 occasions, Beamridge was voted into office, a declared socialist, and the provincial council didn't include a single governor. It was all professionals and middle class. The professionals by the 1890s tended to be radical or left wing. There were some that were in the coterie, the lawyers who were acting for, but there was a radical project. And this is also David Nugent's point, but he in Chachapoyas there wasn't the earlier 1890s. Chachapoyas wasn't politicised then. It becomes politicised through APRA, or together with APRA in the 30s, which is for, as it is popular sovereignty. So again, the terminology is changing, whether it's citizenship or popular sovereignty, but it all has to do with inclusion, which has something to do with representation in the towns. This is not about indigenous society. And that again is partly there has been a fixation, not saying wrong, but it been an imbalance, let's say. Many people have looked at that, the urban, the rural and indigenous. Not so many people, and you've named people who one learns from and gets a cross section, have looked at what were the big fights going on in towns. These were not redouts of oligarchic power by no means, and particularly not one in Cairo, because and each one has a slightly different flavour, but there are these common concepts, whether it's citizenship or representation is not a term I find in the local documents. Fine. It begs other sets of questions, and could be analysed as such. And you ask me other things, and I can.
No, I mean, if for this group of people, they have probably that idea of representation in their claims. You mentioned somebody who was a lawyer that was representing indigenous communities, and when they become part of the apparatus, they seem to have lost that.
Yes.
So when that was transacted, and is a way to perform, is a requirement of the cooptation,
no,
is the way that they transact the
we're looking at another long, big history, which is the whole kind of intellectual process of indigenism, which colours every political movement in the 20th century. Which is I would still say indigenismo was fairly muted in the 19th century, where there was much more of an idea that inclusive citizenship could certainly involve the indigenous communities who lived around your town, who were part of the cercado, who were part of the barrios, who they could be citizens. By the 20th century, that indigenismo as a kind of as a set of ideas was insisting there was a permanent division. And you could have protective and you could give education, but there's something about that any political project that was launched from the town was infected by this idea.
So there's no inclusion there? There's no conceivable inclusion?
19th century, yes.
No, in the 20th century.
20th century, no, but this is all about the town. That's why it's another kind of... That's another kind of...
What are you saying? The indigenismo made frightened people. Every movement that had to include it, but that in turn
it was
made it dangerous.
It was like a colour wash, It was a way of seeing the world in which there was a much greater division between indigena and ciudadano. And it was being...
Sorry. Well, just on that, you have to consider that until 1896, it was the franchise wasn't really closed until 1896. So until then, pretty much voting was the question of representation is very different because it's only then, and people like those. And people who do feel represented, those that Fiona is talking about, they don't want to include necessarily the indigenas of the haciendas or whatever. They don't. They are included because they read and write. It's about reading and writing. It's about literacy, but that's been quite late. 1896 is when it's introduced, the final change in the law, in the electoral law that really closes in on electoral practices that were much more open in the 19th century. In the mid-19th century, you have moments where you have direct elections and you have universal male suffrage. So it's quite interesting that, for instance, one of the issues of representation that you do mention is how they do want to have women voting in the local elections. Women who can read and write. So it's about who's included and who's excluded. And on this question of indigenismo, I think that there's also a lot of regional variance in terms of how indigenismo in the south of Peru, be it in Cusco and Puno, is going to be quite different to the central Andes that are much closer to the mines. And also how being indigenous or indigenated itself is not the cutoff point in voting. It's whether you can read or write. It doesn't matter how indigenous you are as long as you have bettered yourself. So the education aspect, I mean, that's how you're going to bring people in, right? Because that's how you're going to make them modern and included. So I think that maybe some of those things, and the division between the rural and the urban. I mean, again, my grandmother, and even my father remembers there was always the bongo. The bongo was there just to carry the water for the family. And I just kind of find that really shocking that until the 1940s, this was a regular occurrence. And nobody saw this as... Well, they did. They did. My grandfather carried a stick, my great-grandfather carried a stick to beat the bongo and to beat my father if they didn't walk into past milk in the market. And the bongo had to carry everything that he bought at the market.
Stella?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. It's given me a lot to think about, especially methodologically, since your take on contextualizing, also in terms of the earlier phase that you sketched at the beginning. And if I can go back to that with my question, I just wanted to, you mentioned the fact that Greenwich had inspired, at least to some extent, quite a lot of Marietti's ideas, I mean, well, my question is about that. So I actually want to ask you, to what extent that, if you can expand on that, particularly perhaps going back to the education theme, perhaps in terms of educational ideas that are interesting, and so in relation to also intellectually to González but also particularly to Marietti, as you mentioned that he probably it's not been acknowledged, but it's possible that he inspired some of Marietti's.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that because I've got absolutely no evidence of the right to say methodology because I can't but an anecdote that was told me once was that, but anyway. No, I think perhaps to go back, partly following on from Natalia, I think there was an extraordinary openness in the late 19th century to ideas. And you see this in, say, local newspapers. Many towns had local newspapers that would be reproducing articles that editors thought were interesting, coming from all over the world. I mean, and somebody like Greenwich, his father was German, he was probably brought up German and Spanish, but he did acquire English and French. And he was a Quechua speaker. And his main intellectual, well, in terms of what he's remembered for, were two rather amazing, well, one really amazing book and one is a collection which he writes, the Quechua and the Spanish, of cuentos and tales, and this is published 1905. So he had a huge library. He was almost this archetypal provincial intellectual, if you like, but in provincial in a good way. He lived in a province before it becomes provincialized, if you like. He was interested in everything. And he kept in touch to an astonishing degree with what was being produced, including new ideas about education. And many of these ideas were coming from the US about pedagogy. And he wrote quite a number of texts for the use in rural schools about teaching Quechua-speaking children Spanish, and which the text was in Quechua and in Spanish. And these were circulating as far south as Ayacucho. That was what was written in his obituary. That was at a time when the provincial councils were responsible for primary education. Now they lose that responsibility to the state, to ministries, central ministries, in 1903. After that, all these attempts locally to work out how education should be done and produce local texts, these disappear and they get discredited. They're dropped. 1903, Beanrich's reports on how education was functioning in Tarma were published in their entirety by the Ministry of Education in Lima, as a kind of, here is a public servant, he's doing great things for education, and he's very analytical in what is needed and what. 2 years later, that's gone, 1908, Beanrich is gone, and he's not remembered. There's something, this violence that's going on in state, the encroaching state, it's partly to discredit these public intellectuals who accidentally will be remembered, but Beanrich himself was deeply discredited just before he died. So there's all these openings that have been present in particularly 1890s. Suddenly you get this very rapid constriction, and this has implications as to who is remembered as a public intellectual, particularly in a small town. Beanrich, he never married, he never had children. And there's a kind of, he's awkward. He's not conforming to the family kind of models. And although I don't know anybody, again, there was a feeling that he was an oddity. I mean, he becomes represented as a very odd person afterwards. And when I first went to Tarma in the 70s, and people talked about him, he was a weirdo. And it took me years to go through and realise, but this man's been elected twice as mayor. He was part of the literary circle in Lima around González Prada. He chose to come back. González Prada writes about the decentralisation almost with Beanrich in mind, saying, this is the future. We get young men going off and trying to make change in the provinces. So I don't think he was unique. I think in many ways he was a sort of, but he had a certain freedom in that period, in a public space where there was a sufficiently large literate population who read local newspapers. So possibly there weren't that many, but I think there were many more in that period of almost intellectual leaders who saw themselves as belonging to a province as well as to a nation, and who came back from Lima rather than go to Lima. So I've not lost track of your question.
I can relate to some of your comments quite a lot, from the work I did on Argentina, late 19th, early 20th century. A lot of, what we would consider now minor intellectuals,
yes,
who have been completely lost, but actually at the time they were major figures, and then forgotten or, as you said, discredited for different reasons.
Yes.
But actually they've probably influenced, in brackets, it's not probably the right word, but had a lot to do with, but then maybe later on we can say as mainstream, in terms of ideology or intellect. So I can relate to your...
And also handed down through families. I think this very interesting thing is stories and heroes get told and retold. And it's very interesting. I mean, it's very interesting that the groups who would still talk about Beanrich now, and it's mostly that they're coming from district capitals, provincial school teachers, not from town itself. It's now far more his kind of the people who try to remember him most are in the countryside. Partly because of this whole aspiration about education. He's remembered as an educationalist. So,
Okay, well I think maybe we can wrap it up there. But thank you very much, Fiona, for a terrific presentation, and thank you for your questions.